right, we have decaf coffee for any of you who want it, as well as other things, so please help yourselves. A couple of housekeeping things. First, I want to thank the Amelia and Emil Graff Chair of Catholic Theology at Creighton University, who is Todd's husband.
Thanks, Todd.
He sponsors these. At St. Pius X, we present them under the auspices of either the Spectrum team or the Catholic Social Teaching Ministry team. So, welcome. Those of you who are new to our facility, restrooms are out in the, go to the big room, the lobby, and take a right. There is a yellow pad there. If you will sign your name and email, I will send you emails of future theology matters. I will not bombard you with other stuff, but if you want to be on the email list, please put your name in. If you've already signed up years ago, you come regularly, you don't need to sign up again. When the time comes for questions, to make sure that everyone can hear, I will come to you with a microphone. So if you just raise your hands and he'll call on you, we'll make sure that everyone gets to hear it. And so, there is a save the date card over there that is for our next Theology Matters, which is at the end of March, and I do not have a copy of it up here with me to tell you the date or even the title. Wednesday, March 29th, and it will be Father Patrick St. John. Okay, so pick that up on your way out, and let's move on to our speaker tonight, who is Kris Krall. He is a priest in the Society of Jesus and an assistant professor of theology and neuroscience at Creighton University. He has a PhD in the interdisciplinary research of systematic theology and neuroscience, because those go together, from Marquette University. The title of his dissertation is The Human Person Fully Alive, the transformation of the body, brain, mind, and soul of humanity in the encounter with the divinity. Father Krall also has previous degrees from Boston College, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University. He enjoys running marathons, doing triathlons, hiking big mountains, playing most sports, and baking sourdough bread. His research focus is on the neuroscience of Christian contemplative prayer practices and their effects on the conversion in the midst of suffering and human flourishing. He recently published an article in the Journal of Moral Theology on the modern crisis of social isolation. Does anyone remember that? Okay. I have a copy of the article from Moral Theology over there. If you want, I can, if you sign up for an email, I can send you the link directly to it, or you can copy it down. Please join me in welcoming Father Kris Krall.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming out on this cold night. If anything, this is on the touch, and so we can feel a lot of cold. And so hopefully some of the thoughts that we get into today can warm both the soul and the mind and the body. So I'll be using this idea of touch, maybe somewhat loosely and somewhat metaphorically, but definitely get into the deeper implications of touch and what that can mean for us and why we need that as human persons. And so, God's divine touch, I guess it's, we can take this idea of like the God touching the brain, or touching our body, or touching us, or drawing us into the fullness of life. But the question, and actually I was using an image similar to that today in class with my freshmen at Creighton University, and what does it mean to have the divine fingerprint upon us? And what does that mean, and how does it change us, this divine fingerprint? What does this give us as human persons if we, as coming from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, are made in the image and likeness of God, how does that affect us as human persons? And does it make us persons along with the three persons of the divine Trinity? And how does that image and likeness actually get enacted within us? How do we act like God? What is the image that we portray that gives us this godliness? And so Michelangelo was trying to explore this, design this, try to recreate this in the famous Sistine Chapel painting here. And it just as a notice, using this as kind of a metaphorical aspect, that God is almost touching Adam here, but that it's getting real close. But Michelangelo is a master of the human body, and like designing or like painting and trying to capture the movements of the human body. And the term, I think, in Italian is known as contrapposto, and like the twisting and the turning. And so even like in some of his pietas and the David statue, it's like always like emphasizing the body in movement or action and the muscular structure. I had the opportunity even to go and see some of like Michelangelo like practice drawing in his notebooks, and he's like always practicing with hands and muscles and arms and torsos, and so the design, the detail that he put into this, possibly one of the most famous paintings of all time, and how, yeah, this movement of Adam, the soaring movement of the Divine Father coming in and touching, and almost, yeah, getting to this point of touching Adam, giving that divine fingerprint into humanity. But the details, why did he include only certain details? I mean, so that, yeah, the human bodies and the divine body, I guess, are just very, very carefully detailed. But look at some of the background. Not exactly like sunshine, rainbows, butterflies flying around. It's like the plaster on the top of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And then is that like kind of a river that he tried to get into that's kind of behind Adam there? It's like, is this, I mean, like completely off of like perspective. I mean, it's not exactly well done in terms of a river, or like the grass. I mean, it's kind of just got this greenish blobs. I mean, no detail in that. So what he emphasized, the body, and then this interesting big red cape that happens to be around this godly figure. And why that cape? Why that detail? Again, he picked carefully what he chose to emphasize. But what shape do you see in this big red cape around God? Do you see like anything like coming on?
Brain.
No way. You see a brain. And so, wow. Is there a reason for that? And so, like, if we're like just okay, let's kind of, how close did he get here? Not bad. And so, the divine fingerprint, the divine image, made in the image and likeness of God. I mean, we get this touch of the divine onto us. Are we getting rationality, creativity, the memory, the intellect, the will, the ability to think and reason and have the freedom to do so? And so the divine fingerprint, at least using this image of Michelangelo as a way to kind of get into this theme or idea, but is this the way God is gifting us with divinity, image, likeness, to think, to reason, to use imagination, to have this ability to come to new thoughts and be creators along with the Creator himself, that we are co-creators, but the ability to have that thinking and creativity. So I offer today as maybe a kind of an underlying aspect of what this talk is, a trinity of touches. So there's the divine touch that I started to get into, and we'll emphasize a bit more where that came from, the psycho-spiritual touch, and then finally a sense of the physical touch. And so just to get into the divine touch a bit more, I'm not the only one to be thinking about this. St. Augustine, I always emphasize, is probably one of the first neuroscientists. He too is thinking deeply about the human person, what makes us unique, then the flaws and imperfections. Obviously, he had his whole Confessions, the famous book called The Confessions, but another big one is called De Trinitate. And so he's wrestling with the Trinity, how we come to know the Trinity. Can we know the Trinity? Is there any way or any analogy that we can use to fathom what the Trinity is? Now, there's a famous story that has been attributed to St. Augustine that he was apparently wrestling with this idea of the Trinity. Can we know God? How is it three persons, one God? That is, but still the same God, not a triune God, like a trinity of different gods. But it's just, how does this work? As he's walking along a beach wrestling with this, and he comes across a little child. And he's like, in the midst of thought, he's like, "What are you doing, kid?" And the kid's like, "I'm trying to put the sea into this little hole that I dug." And Augustine's like, "You're going to get the sea into this hole? That's never going to fit into this hole, the whole sea." And apparently the way the child looked up at it says, and he says to Augustine, this little kid is like, "So what makes you think you're going to get the whole Trinity into your small head?" Whoa! And so the great mystery of the Trinity, yes, is precisely that, the mystery, but by mystery like the ever-knowable, that which we can continually comprehend and grow deeper and deeper and a deeper appreciation. But one of the aspects that Augustine got into is that there is this, the way we think, the way we process information, and it gets very philosophical, that he's somewhat known as a Platonist in his own thought, but that's like that the forms of all knowledge, of all reality, has to be, as opposed to knowing it for the first time or experiencing it or doing scientific investigation, it's more this recalling it from the depth of our memory. And so the holder of all knowledge, or the place where all knowledge revolves and resides, is the memory. And to that, can he say, is that similar to how we are trying to comprehend God the Father? It's like the source of all wisdom, the very source of love itself, the truth itself. But then from the memory can come forth a particular idea. I mean, for example, if I were to help you recall, go back to your childhood home and the front door as you would walk into your home, and immediately you're going back to your memory palace, and you're going to see and you can call out that particular memory of all the experiences you've had, and all the travels, and maybe all the different homes you lived in, and all the hotels you went into, and all the different doors you've entered your whole life. But you can recall that one, and remember what it looks like, maybe what color it is. But that it's like that's one memory of all the forms can be isolated and drawn forth, and that's from where you came from and who you are. And so what he speculated that is from the memory, the intellect can pull out a particular word. That from all truth can come the one, the way, the truth, the life. And so the intellect, that he says, can this be the Son, or this word that comes forth from the memory? But what is the guiding force then? There's just a directing agent. That's something that I acted as this in your own time, for that to ask you to particular one door, one memory. But that it's is there something that helps you drive your thoughts, your words, your particular actions, or to recall a particular piece of knowledge? And is that what he considers the will? But is that will then what he would equate with the Holy Spirit? And so it's how can we fathom the divine Trinity? Well, it's beyond us, but if we believe in what Genesis says, we are made in the image and likeness of God, and the greatest aspect of us is our ability to reason, to think, to comprehend. Then where else will we look within us but the very way, the thinking process? And so then Augustine proposes in one of his analogies of his De Trinitate book that this memory, intellect, will, all one. It's one process of thinking, one mind, one brain, but these three unique components that play their functions and helping us come to deeper wisdom, deeper knowledge, to be creators. And so, yes, just to emphasize the sense of God said, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion. God created mankind in his image, the image of God. He created them. Is that our ability that we join with the divine Trinity? And so, yes, this unique and amazing attribute of the human being, the intellect, most resembles the divine Creator God. And so this is, just coming directly from Augustine. He says, from the memory is begotten a true word. When we utter what we know, but a word before any sound, before any thought of sound. For it is then that the word is most like the thing known, and the most its image. Because the seeing, which is the thought, springs direct from the seeing, which is knowledge. And so it's that word that we can recognize or emphasize within of all the memories, and then to direct and isolate into one. But there's a lot of choices that go into that. And how do we have this direction of choices which then leads to further decisions? And once we come up with this insight moment, this aha, and this thinking process, we then can make a decision from that. And each decision that we make, does that make us who we are and the uniquenesses of who we are as human persons? And even if we had an identical twin, it would still be a different person. That it's like, because every choice makes us unique. And so just a bit about the neuroscience and the brain changes. And so how do we think? How does this actually happen? Now, St. Augustine, living in the 300s, didn't exactly have the scanning technology that we've recently gotten into these days, of these MRIs and the EEGs, but so especially like these fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And that it's like we don't have to cut the brain open, we don't have to slice anything up, but it's simply the person can be alive, awake, alert, and being asked to think about different aspects, and we can watch the brain parts kind of become activated or grow dormant. And so it's a fascinating, powerful aspect that we can now have. And I guess how my research of theology and neuroscience takes is looking at particular brain prayer practices, now that we can have these images and what happens in the brain as people pray. But we can, if you're interested in that particular aspect, we can look into that in question and answers. But just a little bit of neuroscience for you on this cold evening. To get into some neuroscience. It's so as ironic as this is, the idea of touch, that we're having making the contact. But how the brain actually works is actually the lack of touch, or there's, as the British would say, as you're getting off of the metro, is the idea of mind the gap. Mind the gap. Because there's these gaps, and so that the neurosynaptical structure, when two synapses come together, there's this space between that allows for, well, why? I mean, the question is, why is there this space? Because what's happening is that you have this electrical charge coming down one synapse. It's an electrical charge, which then hits with this like neuron, or starts like this synaptical cleft. And then the electrical charge induces this chain reaction that allows for chemicals to pump out of this one synapse and jump across, and generally, to the gap, and then cause another chain reaction to cause another electrical impulse on the further synapse. And so the question is like, why not just have like one electrical charge? Why do you have to go from electrical to chemical to electrical? Through this gap, which that causes all sorts of variabilities and all sorts of different things. And we talk about anxiety, depression, addictions. It's like, I mean, when you have like antidepressants, it's basically like trying to like plug or clear out the issues that happen inside that cleft because of all the different hormones and different things that are going through that cleft. It's like they get stuck, or they linger too long, and they cause these anxieties and things. And so it's like, wouldn't it be a lot easier if we just had like one clear chute of electrical charges? We can think more efficiently. But, and obviously this goes like so fast that it's like, talking about efficiency, but it's like this all is happening so quickly in most cases. But how we think is about this idea of this cleft, this changes, these from electrical, chemical to electrical. And so the question is, how and where does decisions come in there, or the variability? And does this clef itself allow for the many different ways we can, in essence, make a decision? Because the mind works, the whole brain is filled with billions and billions of these neurons, and it functions all in the same way. And that decisions and actions that we do, or every step that we take, is like this flood of, like this symphony, maybe, of all these synapses working in tangent, and or in synchrony, or sometimes not, to allow for a particular action to go forward, a particular decision. And so, yeah, this idea of what's happening in this particular cleft, or this area of bringing in this to cause one particular aspect or one decision in like the post-synaptic cleft to then allow for one decision. So, but it's like, the big question is it simply a one-to-one ratio? An electrical charge hits, these chemicals shoot across, and it's simply they all get sucked in. Or precisely because of that gap, does that allow for all sorts of variability, or actually an infinite amount of possibilities of how the second cleft can pick up and the charge of the decision can carry on from that? And so that was the question of many neuroscientists back in the 60s when they started to develop this idea of like what's actually happening. And so just an example of this Wilder Graves Penfield, this neurosurgeon in Montreal, he was working with epilepsy patients. And in that case, he was actually able to, he was doing these cranial operations and keeping the patients alive while he was doing this. And he was kind of having fun, maybe, but it's like that he would like tap, and so he'd open up the part of the skull, and he would tap a particular part, and they would ask the patient, like, what do you see, what do you sense, or what happens? And the patient was able to respond while he was having their head wide open. And so one example was that he hit like part of what's called the homunculus and the motor cortex. And he touched a particular part, and the hand just shot up to the patient. And Penfield asked, like, why did you just shoot your hand up like that? And the patient was able to respond, oh, I didn't do that, you made me do that. And it fascinated Penfield because it's like the patient was being able to sit there and recognize the distinction that I have control of certain things, and I'm sitting in this operation room, and I know you're playing with my head, and then you hit something that caused my hand to do that, but I can distinguish my will, my action, my conscious will, from what you hit in my mechanisms to cause this chain reaction. That wasn't me who willed that. He went on to touch other parts of the patient's head while he was doing this, and like he was able to invoke a memory. I mean, going back to the childhood home and walking up to the front door, and like, oh my gosh, there's my front door, and oh my God, my mother would always greet me with fresh cookies or whatever it is. But it's like, and this memory could immediately be evoked, but at the same time, the patient was able to keep these basically three conscious perspectives going. One, the fact that he was sitting in an operation room. Two, the fact that there was this like memory of his childhood home. And three, kind of like the inner eye, able to distinguish these two memories and know that this whole operation is going on simultaneously. And so there's the idea of will, or how is this will even happening? And is there some kind of immaterial force that's able to direct those chemicals within the cleft to go in a particular way to induce another chain reaction, all in symphony across the entire brain to lead to one action? And so this idea of the divine touch, or a willpower, or to assert a particular idea of all the ideas we can have and all the possibilities, well, that brings up, neuroscience. I mean, even more, quantum theory. So we go from neuroscience to quantum theory. It just keeps getting more and more complex as we go. Somebody's got to open the door here to our understanding.
Excuse me, is it possible to move the computer just a little bit over?
So
Because
that
when you're Yeah, then have the pictures
good, thank you.
obliterated, yeah.
And so how these neuroscientists have started to analyze things, that it's like what's happening in that gap can be related very much to quantum theory. Right? This idea of, if you've ever heard like this double slit experiment, where is light a wave or a particle? And well, I mean, it's like if you put it through this particular slit, it exhibits this like wave functionality of like that the wave is like all possible options of where this light particle could be. But then as you put like a measuring device, like measurement A or measurement B in this, it's like, oh, look, it went to A. And so therefore it must be a particle and it went to A. But is it the fact that we stuck our hand in or put a measurement device to actually break down the wave function of all possible options of where this particle could be, but it's because we put in a measurement device. So this is known as like quantum relativity, or this probabilistic. So here's like this wave function, like all the possibilities of where like it could emanate out from these double slits. But this is where the famous Schrodinger idea came up: is the cat dead or alive? It's like, yes, it's both dead and alive. I mean, so it's, these are some of the jokes about that, but it's like, and so this idea that it's like, if a cat's in a box, and we don't know if it's dead or alive, if we open the box and it like just happens that there's like some cyanide in there, why there'd be cyanide in a box with a cat in it, that's another thing, but it's like, if we open it, which causes this chain reaction that hits the cyanide, did we kill the cat, or was the cat already dead? And so was it alive before we opened it up? But the idea that it's like putting our measurement devices in, or causing this like break of the experiment, are we determining where a particular particle is? Is there some will to this movement? So I guess that's the connection I'm trying to make with like the neuroscience, or not just me, but this Pengrove and this Eccles, that I'll get to in a bit, in terms of they're all trying to wrestle with this idea of like how the brain is working, but it's allowing for this will to then break, like, and we could be doing a lot of things right now. We could be like running outside naked in the cold, and it's like, but you're choosing to sit here and listen to me talk about quantum theory and neuroscience. Or you could just be sitting nicely at a TV and watching something else, or reading a good quiet article in front of your fireplace. And we could be doing all sorts of things, but you choose one action, and you choose to go forward with that. And so it's like you're breaking the possibility of all options down to one. The wave function of like all possibilities of what we could be doing is broken down to just one, because as Eccles and this Penfield is starting to say, it's like there's a will that's directed. It's a non-material force within the mind that's directing us and directing all those synapses, and they're like the neurosynaptical clefts, to like go in one particular direction. And so this is like how we're like neuroscientists are wrestling with a sense of consciousness and decision making, and that it's like that, do we stand, do we sit, do we both? It's like, how do we make a decision? It's like, I will stay standing, or I will sit down, or every action that we make. I mean, we do this so naturally, we do it so quick, but what's actually happening in the brain? And so this John Eccles is kind of the one who got into this. He was awarded a Nobel Prize for some of the work that he was doing, so a very respected neurosurgeon, got into this idea of quantum neurotheology, and this idea of like that when those neurotransmitters are going through the gap that isn't touching, but that is like it allows for these chemicals to jump the gap, but that even Eccles, he wrote in his diaries and his different workbooks and things, that it's like there must be some non-physical force that directs, like the measurement device, measurement A or B, that directs, in a sense, the particles to go to one way in the light experiment. But here it's like some non-physical force. Well, it's like, from a philosophical, theological perspective, it's like, yeah, that's me. That's my consciousness. That's my decision making. That's the will. Augustine could have told you that back in the 300s. But is it for the first time that in the neuroscience, as the way neuroscience has advanced in the last 50, 60 years, that it's like for the first time we can actually see it's like there's something going on here in terms of how we make decisions and free will. And that there's all the possibilities, the spectrum and the variability of everything we could do, but there's some direction. And is that a non-material force that no matter how much neuroscience we do, will it still never lead to the idea of like finding out like, oh, well that's the chemical process of the will, or there's something directing that. Now there's like all these different, like the science of the receptors within like each of these clefts is like still being done. And there's a friend of mine who's at Marquette University doing a full PhD in neuroscience, and he's doing his PhD on these particular receptors called the EATS, E-A-A-T-S. It's like these such a long neurochemical, I don't even remember what they're called, but it's like it's shortened to E-A-T-S, EATS. His whole PhD is on this, but it's like how exactly they're placed within the receptacle cleft, and what exactly causes them to receive certain neurotransmitters. And so they're really trying to dig into exactly like how it is that this neurotransmission occurs to allow the thinking process, but is it the ability to be able to will, to direct our decisions in one way. And so, how we have experiences, understanding, judgments, decisions, and all the variability through that, and the magic of quantum integration. But the question is like, going back to our opening slide of like how God, the divine touch within us, and what is this divine touch, that we have this ability to think, to imagine, to be creative. And where is that happening? Many of the, like even criticisms, but like many of the neuroscientists, they call it like neurotheology right now, and they're really trying to speculate, and they've been doing all these different prayer studies, especially like with Buddhist monks, that they, I wonder if I could pull this up quick, right here is an example. They literally put like Buddhist monks into the MRI machines, and they watch as they get into these enlightenment states. So there's been a lot of people doing this. One of the biggest people is this, he's on the right behind setting up a guy called Richard Davidson. He's at Madison, and he's working in this center that he started called the Center for Healthy Minds. And and they've been doing a lot, but it's the idea that within the thinking process, or that they're looking for a particular part of the brain that lights up or doesn't light up. Or here's another friend of mine, his name is Michael Ferguson, and he's at the Harvard study for brain circuit therapeutics. And he's trying to find like this spirituality circuit within the brain, or a particular unique place where when people have a religious experience, this part of the brain is lighting up. The God synapse is what they're looking for. And they narrowed in on what's called the periaqueductal gray region, which is deep in the midbrain, that it's like when there's a tumor, so they kind of did reverse a study where it's like if a tumor is pushing in on that particular area of the midbrain, it seems like these types of patients are having more and more induced spiritual experiences. They can just experience this grace. Interesting, but what this quantum theory is kind of resisting there, pushing against all these theories of the God synapse or reductionistic, like all it is this light sitting, like this part of the brain becoming activated or lighting up, and you have a spiritual experience. Well, you can do all sorts of things to make that happen. They call it like transcranial stimulation, where they put this electrode on the skull when a person's awake, and they can stimulate the electricity going through those pulses. And it's like, oh, I'm having a religious experience right now. If that's all we need, I'm giving up my work as a priest, and like, so much for church. All you need is just pass out transcranial stimulators, and you can have the rest. But is that what makes an authentic prayer experience? And so that's going to be the big question. Or you can pass out a bunch of psychedelics, and you'll have a lot of fun. And that's people are experimenting with those too. But the idea of how does the divine touch, getting back to our main theme here, is the idea of, is the divine touch not just a reductionistic approach, like this synapse here lights up, or this part of the brain goes dormant or not? Is it that in every synapse, in every cell of our body, in every way, that there is this non-physical, even these neuroscientists, Eccles and Penfield, a non-physical urging force that allows and cares for this every decision of every thought, and it's not just in one part, but it's in every cell and every fiber of our being and every neurotransmitter chemical that goes across it. But it's this directing, urging, gently force of call it grace, call it this motivation, inspiration, the way that God touches us, and where, but in the most powerful place that we have that distinguishes us from all other creatures and all other parts of creation, but how we think and how we make decisions and how we act intentionally. And the divine touch is not just one part of the brain, but the whole of who we are, and then directs us to be the best of who we can be. And so, yeah, just the sense of the total quantum integration. Here's what Eckel says: since materialist solutions fail to account for our experienced uniqueness, I am constrained to attribute the uniqueness of the self or soul to a supernatural spiritual creation. And this is Eckel's book, Evolution of the Brain, Creation of the Self, 1989. But so that's the neuroscience, and thanks for bearing with me, neuroscience and quantum theory all in one lecture. But where's the theology in this? This is Theology Matters series, not all neuroscience. And so here's a quote from Archbishop Oscar Romero, now saint, and talking about really the incarnation. This is an Advent homily that he wrote. And just sorry for all the text, I can get this to you, that Christians are not people who wait for everything at some future time, but Christians know that for 20 centuries, Christ is at work in the midst of humanity. And if men and women accept Christ, then they become these new women and men that society needs so that the world can be organized according to the heart of God. But that idea of we have to accept Christ, and that's our decision. And so it's that ability to recognize that there is this force urging us, but is there an acceptance on our part or not? Christ is now in history. Christ is in the womb of the people. Christ is now bringing about the new heaven and the new earth. And the work of Advent is involved in this vigilance and faith to discover the fact that Christ is continually coming. Advent is Christ's presence as he uses his preachers, his priests, his catechists, his Catholic schools, all the effort meant to bring about God's true reign, telling humanity that Isaiah's prophecy is now fulfilled. Emmanuel, God with us. And that idea of God with us, the divine touch in the world, in our lives, in every fiber of our being, in every movement and decision that we make, that goes through all the synapses in the great symphony that makes us as human persons, joining with the divine trinity of persons. And so the divine touch, how that allows us to be intentional in everything that we do. So intentionality, I argue, is the very key to what it means to be person. And that's true for both the human and the divine persons. To intentionally will creation, let there be light, let the birds of the air come forth. It's this intentional act, an intentional decision on God's part. And then let us make people, human persons in our image and likeness. But that drives us to run these crazy marathons and things. I don't know why people go that far. But then it's like even this calmness, this power over the seas and the chaos of our lives that Christ can bring us. This intentionality, and to be a true, fully alive human person, is it the ability to make a carefully thought out and willed decision. And what's the best decision we can make but to love itself, to be agents of love, to be these preachers of truth in our own place, in each place that we find ourselves, to be these instruments of God's peace in the world. So how God touches us, but when this happens, are we encouraged and drawn to reach out to others? And I guess in the sense of prayer, is it to how that the intention is to seek God and to touch God or to recognize how God is touching us, the openness and receptivity that we can have. Just recently, so I guess what's developing further in terms of neurotheology and prayer studies with neuroscience is this idea of moving on simply beyond like, oh, this part of the brain is activated, lights up, this part goes dormant, is recognizing these different, they're calling them neural signatures, or these like harmonic patterns within the electricity patterning of all the synapses. And is there a pattern that could be universally recognized when a person experiences grace or a heightened moment of what Ignatius of Loyola would call consolation or desolation? And are there these patterns that could start to be recognized either in like EKGs or EEG, more EEG, but even there's a lot of actually work happening with heart math and the heart variability patterns and things, and is there like a brain-heart connection in terms of finding these total bodily rhythms? As again, so it's like it's stepping more aside from simply seeing or like using, as neuroscientists want to do, a reductionistic approach of the human person of like, oh, it's just this synapse. It's like when this particular neurotransmitter chemical goes through, that must be what you're saying God is. But it's like, is it more the effects that we have? Like when grace comes into our life, do we fall into this particular harmonic pattern? That the dissonance of our lives is dissipated and we're entering into a greater harmony. Using that thought of harmony is what St. Ignatius of Loyola did. Sorry, as a Jesuit, I have to bring Jesuit lingo in at some point to do this. And so he, within his exercises, he actually equated the divine trinity to these three divine notes. Augustine used brain patterns. Ignatius of Loyola used these divine notes. And his understanding was raised on so high. So this is like Ignatius's spiritual autobiography. And so his understanding was raised most high as to see the most holy Trinity under the aspect of three keys on a musical instrument. And Ignatius's loquela would consist of inner words, pregnant meaning, tone, rhythm, and music. He would pay, so this is kind of a commentary on Ignatius. He would use more attention to the tone, the music, and less attention to the spiritual meaning they contain. And so consolation and desolation over Ignatius's life became less and less about here's my rose or my thorn. It's much more, am I in a harmonious relationship with my God, or is there some kind of dissonance or tension or frustration, agitation, and to feel that in terms of a tension or dissonance. And so this harmony, and so the idea of like, could we find are these certain brain signatures or neural signatures that would be indications that a person would be more at peace, more in consolation, and that would be affecting their whole being, like from heart rate to circadian rhythms to other aspects. And so the divine touch, does it change us not just in one place, a reductionistic approach, but does it lift us to the heights or bring us to greater harmony and deeper, or even in the positive psychology talked about flow. Csikszentmihalyi had this whole book on the sense of flow or movement, and so is the sense of, is there these patterning that we could start to see or recognize if we were to do some of these measurements. I guess the big question is, how can we measure grace? Can we find this? And it's somewhat of a tense aspect, but it's like, well, I mean, can you measure harmony, or can you at least see if there's a greater harmonic resonance in higher and lower ways? So the questions of the divine touch, and that can we recognize how we are brought out to be fully alive and part of this divine Trinity when we become part of this. And so we want to have, as St. Thomas did to Jesus, like that Christ has touched us. Are we willing and able to respond in this intentional way of reaching out in our prayer, in our love of each other, of care for each other? So the idea of the divine touch, which we can get through our liturgies, through our sacraments, through all the different aspects. And so the idea of how this divine touch affects our personhood, our whole relationality, how we come to know who we are best, and is it the best, and we are in prayer intentionally, in community intentionally, in actions of love and service and self-giving, do we find that harmonic resonance as human persons. So just briefly then, kind of these two other elements of touch, the psycho-spiritual touch. There is this neuroscience known as known as the mirror neurons, that it's like when a person watches another, and they've done this with putting two people into these MRI machines and scanners and watching, one person is like induced with like extreme pain, and another person is just supposed to watch that person in pain. But they're recognizing that as the other person watches, that it's actually inducing the same brain activations as what's happening in the person who's actually experiencing that. So they're calling this phenomenon mirror, as the neurons are mirroring each other, but the other person is not actually experiencing the physical pain, but it's through watching the emotions and watching the other person in suffering. Well, what in the spiritual world, like, well, of course, it's compassion, suffering with, being in the suffering of another. But it's like now, for like, again, the first time in the human history that we're able to actually recognize, like, my gosh, like there's a physiological aspect that's happening here, and this touch and this sense of being in communion with the other people who are suffering. And can this actually be extended to like around the world? And it's like when there are these like tragic accidents or different things or people suffering in different countries, do we actually have this physical movement or emotional feeling? Or sometimes even mothers have this for their children or different aspects. And so the idea of the psycho-spiritual touch that can be very powerful, that what brings us together as human persons, what draws us together as a community of faith, a community of believers, of people who can suffer together, but in our suffering or even in our joys, to share those joys together. And so that when another person experiences great joy, is that also passed along? Is the same parts of the brain light up in the other person? So this is sharing and extending ourselves, and it's like that we have this ability to pick up and then embrace or feel through our human connection, or the psycho-spiritual ability of touch. And maybe just this last, the most physical aspect of touch itself, there is this experiment done by this group of scientists that I call the Compassion Instinct book up here that I use by this Dalcher Keltner, if you'd like to get the reference for that. But they talked about having these two people, didn't know each other at all, sit behind this like blockade so they couldn't see each other's face or any emotions, but simply they could reach through like this box and like have this touch. And it was this one person was supposed to convey through the simple touch of hands one of the 12 emotions, so either anger or empathy or care, compassion of sorts, and that the other person was supposed to name the emotion that they felt when they actually felt this touch of the other hand. And the remarkable ability that it's like the receiver was in the 90th percentile in terms of accuracy. And that is these, maybe it's almost, of course, it's like, could we tell? That when another person simply, or we have this ability to actually touch, and like the sensors going through our hands, and like that's like when we can actually feel it, like there's something there's something deeper, and is there the ability is, so a paraphrase of the Beatles song of all we need is love is, all we need is touch, isn't it? That it's like to bring us together. And so the importance of the divine touch, but does that then, if we're made in this image and likeness, then do we begin, because we have been touched by the divine and given this great ability, we can share how we portray ourselves, how in both the psychosocial, but also in the very physical touch, that it's like that we have this ability to portray who we are, what we're about, our deepest emotions, but it's intentional. It's like that, or not. And so to be a person, to be fully alive, is to make this careful decision to use that non-material agent willpower to direct our hopefully best of ourselves, our love, out to transform the world. And so if anything, that is kind of echoing Archbishop Oscar Romero, Christ is here in history. Christ is alive now, if only we choose to intentionally accept him and bring him in, and with all our words, thoughts, and actions, to preach him and proclaim him with our lives. Thank you very much. yeah, questions, and here's the mic, and I'll use this one.
What does happen to the brain when we pray?
Oh, you wanted, okay, dive right in. Well, much. Oh, this is a little more accurate. Okay, yeah, much happens in the brain, and that's kind of the exciting thing. So some of the studies that I'm particularly doing is a contrast to what there's been many years and been a lot of research done with mindfulness techniques as well as like the Buddhist meditations, contemplations. Many neuroscientists don't want to touch the idea of, sorry for the pun, unintended, they didn't want to touch the idea of a transcendent prayer experience because there's a classic experiment done by these two guys, Beauregard and Paquette. They took these Buddhist monks, put them under an MRI machine, and say, okay, when you hit enlightenment, pull the string, we'll flash on the machine, we'll see exactly what's happening in the brain when you're hitting enlightenment. A lot of data, a lot of neat results. Some parts of the brain went very dormant, other very particular parts kind of were lighting up. They were able to connect with these Carmelite nuns, these Carmelite religious order of nuns, and they pretty much gave the same directions. Okay, when you're in your peaceful, happy place of grace and bliss, pull the string, we'll turn the light, and then we'll see what happens to the brain. Well, the Carmelite nuns like, listen, we can't just summon God at will. I mean, that's not the way God works. And we can become receptive. So at least the nuns were honest about this. And so that's what kind of scares a lot of neuroscience. Like, well, you can't measure God, or even if you did, it's like God works in His time and place. So it's like we're always going to be waiting, and is this God or not? And so the idea of the transcendent type of prayer experiences is where science kind of has this conflict or tension or dialectic with our Christian theology. I guess at the end of the week, I'll be actually going to San Diego to present at this neuroscience contemplative conference. And this colleague and I, he's another Jesuit, he's a specialist in medieval Carthusian prayer practices, and we've done an investigation of the cloud of the unknowing by this an unknown author sometime in the Middle Ages, and how this other Jesuit, William Johnston, did a lot of connection with Zen with the cloud. And so is there this deeper, a connection in terms of this kind of contemplation of the Christian entering into this cloud of unknowing, or to like simply be embraced by the all-encompassing love, but it's much of what the cloud talks about is like this total emptiness of self, or total receptivity, so as to get to that place of being able to then receive the love. And simply the process or the prayer practice of like bringing ourselves to that total receptivity, the movement in a sense of the prefrontal cortex or the decision-making capacity, the sharp consciousness, to more it's like the aspect of the heart, and what I think it's Pascal, the heart has reason which reason knows not of, but that idea of like moving from the head to the heart can be this quite a different, the longest journey of our lives. But can we study this? Well, the hope is like, can we, especially in the contemplative Christian practices, and so I've gone back to the cloud, as well as like these desert traditions of John Cashin, and some of the other desert practices of these deep kind of contemplations, and it's like to rekindle that kind of aspect, and can that be this way of then entering into these like neural signatures. The biggest aspect of Christianity is this non-reductivistic approach, that we are, as the Jesuits and like all it's plastered all over Creighton University, the cura personalis, the care for the total person. That it's like, as opposed to simply isolating ourselves off to all we are is a prefrontal cortex, or all we are is like limiting us down or reducing us. And so it's what I care about in terms of prayer is like, you can have this prefrontal cortex lights up and like this other part goes dormant. Interesting. But I want to know like, why are you going out to getting up early in the morning to take your children to the hospital if they're needed, or why you're giving up so much of your time and energy going into a soup kitchen and volunteering. The behavior and the love that we share in the total aspect of our life is, and so I guess another experiment that I was able to run was like, that if I tried to bring in, we'd had these EEG measurements along with them writing a narrative about what they were experiencing as they were going through psychological inventory tests, all of it while I was like teaching them these contemplative prayer practices over a 10-week period. And so I was trying to get a more sense of what the totality of like from the narrative experience to the neuroscience to the psychological, and then how prayer was changing them. And as we know, it's like prayer works, God works on its own time, and it takes a very long time. Many of the studies that you read about in terms of meditation and contemplation things, like, well, in 2 weeks, this novice group had similar experiences to these monks who were meditating for the last 40 years, 10 hours a day. But it turns out like a little part of the brain that seemed to light up with the monks also started with these people who got up off their couch for 2 weeks and tried a little mindfulness practice. Interesting correspondence, yes, 2 weeks. I mean, any good practice, it's 30 days into the new year. Hopefully they have a good New Year's resolution going right now. I mean, it works, but it takes time. And it takes time to develop habits of prayer and transformation. So, not exactly an answer to your question, but inroads, hopefully.
I don't really have a question as much as a comment, because for me, I see so many implications with our sacraments. And when we think of coming out of the pandemic and what we had to avoid during the pandemic, which was touch, which was not being around people, but not being able to have a real sign of peace, not being able to process with others to communion, or being very, very careful, with our masks when we received communion. But the fullness of all of the symbols, the water, the anointing with oil, I mean, how can you not have touch? But it becomes much more, less individual, but more communal, like Romero's quote about the church, the ecclesia as the body of Christ.
Yeah, wonderful comments, and thank you for bringing all that up. And yeah, again, even going back to the importance of the sacraments, like the matter and the form, and that it's like when the matter is there, like the oils, the waters, actually tasting the communion, and actually then being a part of this great the communal aspect. I was helping out with the confirmation during the pandemic, and we were using like these like long Q-tips to like do the seal, like whoa, you stand there, but I was like, but no, the whole point of like we just said like the touch, the emotions that are expressed, and so it's like we missed it, but so the importance of that, and I guess it's, yeah, if you're interested in that article I wrote, it was just kind of all about that, and in terms of that the importance of this kind of this Yves Congar I used, a Dominican during the Vatican II, but he talked a lot about this in the sense of the supra-ecclesial community of this being drawn together, and that we were all moved by the Holy Spirit to become this body of Christ. And so it's, yeah, I mean, to be held back in that or limited in that touch, it's like we're no longer persons. And it's like it fractionates and isolates ourselves. And so thus, of course, anxiety, depression, suicide, drug use is skyrocketing. It's like we're not us, we're not fully alive. And so, yeah, so thank you for that. Oh, you got that article there? Okay, so there you go.
I don't. I got a loud voice. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Two-part question. One, have neuroscientists looked for disharmony and sin in the brain and targeted that in the way they've looked for or discovered harmony and grace? And then also, in terms of addiction, say, in neuroscience and looking at how the brain is influenced by all sorts of biological, chemical reactions, what does that do to free will and our understanding of morality? So, yeah.
Huge and great question. One of the world's leading atheists, Sam Harris, just came out with a book called Free Will. And he begins the book by bringing up this like gruesome, like whole, like cold-blooded murder that these two guys just like went into a family's house and like brutally killed everybody. And just like, and you ask like, so why did they do that? And is there free will involved in that? And he makes this argument and he kind of plays that out to saying like, we don't have any free will because when they actually like found it, like what happened to these guys like many years before, it's like, well, they were abused as children, and then turns out they had like these brain tumors, both of them, that like precluded them from even having any kind of rational choice. Mm-hmm. And so it's all part of like the physical structure, and that if like these certain parts of the brain get restricted or the tumor grows or stinted because of like what they call adverse childhood experiences, the ACE inventory, if you've heard of that. Mm-hmm. And so that it's like because of our either previous experience, how we grew up, or the genetics that we've had, or like tumors, that it's like that we simply have no free will at all. It makes a pretty compelling argument that it's like, we are just like reductionistic to our materialistic components, and that it's like that we're just a product of our evolutionary and domestic kind of growth. Mm-hmm. But I guess it emphasizes all the more of the importance of, yet if we foster communities of love, care, if there is this touch from a very early on, that it's like that. Is that going to help foster or create or allow us to grow into ever more free, responsible, and intentional persons? Like so we can look at the extreme examples when everything goes wrong, and even now this is kind of somewhat controversial, and but that even Aquinas talked about, like that he basically came to the point of saying that the death penalty is acceptable, but only at the extreme case that it's like a person has chosen or has through influence has become so much of a beast that they have smudged out the divine imprint within them, and they are menace to society, and so are no longer even carrying the human dignity and value that was once with them. And it's like, is that one case where like the death penalty can be used? But it's like, we can look at those absolute extreme cases, but if the super ecclesial community works as it can, if we allow grace to enter, if we recognize and accept Christ into our lives, do we become ever more fully human, which then brings out our humanity. So it's like, I've used the term, it's not even I was bringing up with my students today, like the idea of hurt people. Mm-hmm. I didn't just stutter there, that's not a real It's the idea that if the people who are hurt, who have gone through hurt, or they've been hurt by the ACE inventories, or, generations upon generations of hurt people, like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or something, it's like generations upon generations, it's like that they have lost or become so numbed by pain and suffering does that divine image, the touch, that we forget what that is, that we get smudged out. And so, free will is humanity at its best, but to actually have that portrayed and lived out is, that it takes the best and an openness to grace too. And so it's like, can we get to the point of like, helped people help people, and does that then begin to propagate? We can reverse these cycles of these inadverse touches to be touches of more love and care and compassion, and over time is there this healing and transformation, and so to bring back our free will. But if we only look at the extreme cases of hatred, then it's like, we're smudging it all out. There is no free will because, it's more and more we're just being restricted. And I guess that gets to your second part of that sense of like addictions and habit patterns and things. And so, the brain is a master at efficiency, and it's like we naturally will form habits. We are habit makers. It's like, when's the last time you actually thought about brushing your teeth? If you did, your toothpaste would be all over your face. But it's just the fact that it's like if you do it non-thinking, then it's like it's more automatic. Or I was helping to teach a class in J in terms of sports. It's like if an athlete is actually thinking about how they're shooting the free throw, they're going to miss. But if it's like considered muscle memory, or it's just like automatic and they don't have to think about it. And so it's like that we're natural habit makers, but when these habits become addictions to, yeah, I mean, you name it, from drugs to pornography to alcohol to anything else, and so it's like we get so into these habits and patterns that it's like, again, it numbs us out. We don't think about it, but it becomes this endless cycle. But at the same time, if it can become these habits of the habituation of love, of receptivity, of openness, of grace, does that also build us up? I mean, so it's, the brain will naturally seek to be efficient and use less energy, and so like these particular neural tracks like automatically form, and it's like the more you do it, the more you practice it, it's like the deeper ingrained that becomes. But I mean, they talk about like mindfulness is trying to continue to every day like go home in a new way each time, or to always be creative and to constantly keep thinking in new ways to like open up possibilities, and that's like our intentionality. And so in some ways we can resist the urge to fall into those habits and patterns, even though we're so naturally prone to it. And I guess that's where, again, where we're not confined or stuck into this rigidity or simply like doing the same thing over and over again simply because it's like going through the motions, but it's like when we can still choose, it keeps us young, it keeps us human, it keeps that intentionality all fresh. And so I guess that's where, yeah, I encourage, like, habits are good to a certain level, but to be fully alive, break out of the habits and or like, I mean, at least like use the habits as more. I was preaching yesterday on the Beatitudes, and it's like he's not talking about habits; he's talking about a way of life, a way of living and moving and having being. And it's like, blessed are the peacemakers. It's not like, oh, I just have to be like doing my habit of peacemaking. It was like, no, it's like I have a culture that like my whole being is about exuding peace in every new situation that I find myself. And so it's developing not just a new fad guy habit, it's developing a way of being that can be creatively exerted in every new situation and every new circumstance.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah, we got one more out there.
I could just, on this last point, so in the last 20 years, obviously there's been a huge explosion in social media, online technology, the ways that we connect with people. And in some ways the pandemic revealed positive dimensions of that, in terms of FaceTime calls with grandparents. And yet there seems to be something that doesn't quite go all the way. And so as you noted, we also have record levels of depression, anxiety, suicide, isolation. Why is to summarize my question, why is all this online connectivity not doing it for us? Or what's missing in a way? Is it just the last point here, the physical, or is there something more or is it too much almost? Is it like overstimulation from a neurological? I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it definitely does. I think in some
I'm
ways.
trying not to demonize it, right? I think that happens too much. There's a lot of good in it, but it doesn't seem to quite. Right, there's something that's missing from people, or else we would be much happier.
I mean, there's many ways. I think there's like the technology. I mean, we're still looking at analyzing this. I think neuroscientists, psychologists are all still like going through this and what exactly is it doing. And, I mean, you can watch movies like The Social Dilemma and all those kind of things causing the separations. In some way, like, I'll take a more theological, sacramental approach. I mean, like, why we still don't have like Zoom confessions, or I mean, some of these kind of things. The term that was used early on, like going back in the 1960s when they were first talking about like this real resistance to televise the mass. And it was just like, and there's this early thing, and the term that they used was, you're missing the moral distance, or the moral distance has been breached. And that it's like if you're not actually in the presence of the actual form and matter that's being done in the physical, then there's this there's a separation from the sacramental graces that are possible, or that there's the necessity to have this communal, and then, I mean, how does that divine touch actually happen? And is it, we are corporeal beings of the incarnational God who came to be Emmanuel. And so, I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, from a theological perspective, is it like, is there importance to have this moral distance? We can convey information, but, and I guess that's still, I mean, is it going to be something like Eccles is proposing in terms of like, there's some non-physical force that's urging these neurotransmitters across? Well, it's like, is there some non-physical force when we're together as people, as opposed to just looking at everybody through these screens, but that it has to be in this physical, at least contactile moral distance, and that, yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, we can kind of speculate and do a lot of thoughts. I mean, one of the issues that scientists would push back at this is like, and it's even like this whole quantum stuff, and like, there's a lot of criticism. This is like a theory, but it's like scientists would push back. It's like, well, that's just the God of the gaps thing. We just aren't there yet, and so it's just like, just wait. We're going to figure out how those neurotransmitters get across, or just wait. Like, we'll find a way to like have, I don't know, smell will go through our computers, and that'll be all the better because we can smell the other people or something. I don't want to. But it's like, I don't know. It's like there's something. It's like, do we need? Is the importance of like knowing? I maybe just one other thought. I was reading this on like the autonomic nervous system, and there's like the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, and the sympathetic is the fight or flight, the parasympathetic kind of the rest and digest. One of the things that I was in this trauma book, it's Elizabeth Stanley called Widen the Window, writes about, is that before, in this shift from parasympathetic, so in your nice state, and then you see this bear charging you, that it's like, I mean, whatever it is, I mean, so the switch, the first aspect that, as opposed to jumping directly into the sympathetic, is what they're finding is more, it's like this social connection reaction that stays in the parasympathetic. So for example, and I bring it up to my students, like, what's the first thing you do when you do this exceptionally embarrassing thing? And I just recently saw this like poor girl like get out of the car and hit flat her face after hitting the ice. And it was just like, I mean, she was fine, but it was just like, the first thing you do is like look around to see if anybody just saw that. But it's like, you don't want to look stupid, but that reaction, like if it was something very serious, you're looking around to see, is there somebody here who could help me? And that it's like, if it was serious, and I started calling out in deep desperation, would anybody care? Would anybody see? And if there is there, then the sympathetic would be less induced, or at least it could be like kept calmer. Then it's just like, I'm all alone, and I got nothing, and I'm nobody, and so now I really got to get going. And so this first element that we're always looking for is like, is there anybody here? That we have this instinctual reaction simply for protection or care or sharing joys, showers, sorrows, or even embarrassment, but that it's like, at least there's someone who saw this and knows that I'm hurt, if I'm not hurt, they can laugh at me, we can joke together, whatever it is, but it's like the need and want for connection here and intimate. I mean, every kid on the campus has a phone. I mean, it's like they know they're connected in a sense, but it's like, when I took a fall or whatever, it's like, would somebody be here who could actually help me? And so is there, I don't know, is there something deep within us that's like, if I'm looking around in the room that I'm presently in, is there at least somebody here?
Just a quick comment, I was just wondering if you could conceptualize the Mass on TV. Oh, I'm loud enough. If you could conceptualize the Mass on TV as just a bigger synapse.
Huh.
Bigger what?
Synapse.
Oh.
Wow.
Could you repeat that?
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I just wondered if you could conceptualize, you were talking about Mass on TV, and couldn't you just conceptualize that as just a bigger synapse? You just have to jump, you know, you just have something to jump over, but the motivation is still there. People still want to watch the Mass on but you just have to conceptualize it differently. The screens may not all be evil. It's just maybe another thing to go across.
Very true, but even in the synapse, there's the
There's the neurotransmitters.
which are chemical. It's not just this electric
Right.
jump. It's not just.
Well, God is everywhere.
So there's the questions that we're still wrestling with.
What about, I mean, it's just so fundamental that children fail to thrive if they are not touched, infants. So that, could you speak to that at all, or is that just such a given that we don't even need to talk about it anymore?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, all the studies that have been done, that if a child is not touched for the first few months, then it's like permanent brain damage, and that it's like the neurotransmitters and this whole pruning process of the brain or development of this synaptical structures are just like drastically altered, affected, and so it's, yeah, so that's why you included almost like this primate image of the monkeys, and they're always, you go to the zoo here, and you can always watch like the monkeys like picking things out of each other's hair and stuff, and they just, I mean, this is instinctual. It's like they do it all the time. It's like, why has it become so sensitive for us? Or like why is it at a certain age like we become more like that? I mean, for the mothers are always obviously to have the touch of that, but have we as a society, maybe it's like, we were just joking ahead of time, like that in the United States society, we've become kind of separate in the kind of Germanic way, but it's like why the virus spread so quickly in Italy, because it's like they love touching each other. They're always hugging and standing 2 feet apart, yelling at each other, and it's like, and using their hands and things. And so it's like that, but I don't know, we become almost super sensitized to that. We need our physical space, like don't come any closer, thank you. And it's like, but yeah, I don't know, we're missing something, and are we becoming more isolated or socially fragmented? But yeah, and I think that's like, it is just so fundamental from our primates are teaching us this and all of creation. There's this importance of the touch. And so, yeah, to lose that, to lack that is like, we're no longer persons. It pulls us away from that.
Which means we're only persons in community.
Precisely. Precisely. Because we reflect the divine Trinity, which is a communal God and one God's very nature. That's right.
Any questions?
Any more questions?
I'm just a comment.
Yes, I did music for years, I know Mike's. What depresses me about our modern society, even in the last 10 years, is the addiction to phones. I mean, this is not a touchy thing. This is not a touchy question, but it's an eye contact question. We not only can't reach out and touch people, maybe, but walking around a campus or anywhere, and I'll be looking and saying hello, and they're addicted to this thing in their hands. And that's what depresses me the most. You can't even get eye contact with young people or other human beings. And I notice, I'm at the College of St. Mary a lot, and I'll notice that if they're coming down the hall or coming down the sidewalk, they immediately put up their phones because they're afraid to, that's their way of not looking and even making eye contact, let alone saying hello, how are you? But I guess I'm just commenting on where we lose even eye contact because they automatically hide in their phones. And that's, they're transmitting out to the other universe of what they're constantly communicating with. And you can't even say, gee, good morning, how are you? Nice day today.
Because they won't hear you.
They've got the earbuds
Well,
No ears, no
I guess I have to go like this. Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. So not only do we lose physical touch with people, but God works through our eyes too, and
Windows to the soul. Yeah, and I
It
guess
just, it
one thing.
utterly depresses me. 'Cause,
Oh,
you know, 10 years ago, I said, this is going to get worse and worse
What's
and worse.
wrong with our kids today?
I'd be up at the campus of Creighton trying to say hello to the students, and they were addicted, and now they're more addicted and more and more and more addicted. And that's all they focus on is that little thing in front of them.
And in some ways, they're communicating. They have all these social networks, but it's never with the people right in front of them, which is kind of the interesting thing. So their communication is incredible, but it's
Yeah,
like
they're
I can't
communicating, but it's all out there. It's
Yeah,
not
the
in
physical
front of them.
presence. One other thing in terms of, I mean, when we talk about eye contact, they talk about we as human beings are one of the few organisms that are, mammals that actually have so much white so that we can trace like where we're at each other are actually looking. And so that, I mean, like most monkeys, dogs, I mean, a few huskies have some of those amazing blue eyes and stuff, but it's like, you can't actually see where they're looking, but we trace each other's eyes, and there's an importance to that. And that to see where the whites are versus where the other parts, it's just like, are you looking at me? Are you looking off? Or why, like lie detector tests, aren't they? It's like if you have a sketchy eye, or you start shifting your eyes or something, it's like, oh, you must be lying about something. But it's like, as you said, the eyes communicate so much. And when, they're fixated on this thing and not able to make contact.
And while they are communicating, they are communicating with other, is it on?
Yes.
They're communicating with other people, but we talk about isolation. I mean, you walk down the sidewalk, you want to say, good morning, how are you? And you feel more isolated because they're off in La La Land on their phones, talking to other people. But anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. We lose touch, we lose eyes.
Can I make a comment too? A friend of mine was nursing her child and talking on the phone, and he stopped nursing. He would not nurse if she was not attending to him. So it was that fun.
Put down the phone, Mom.
So at a very, very young age, they know that just physical presence isn't enough. It is being present while being physically present. Interesting.
Share the presence of oneself.
And I'm just going to make the comment about our society today and how we've become more reticent to touch each other because of a lot of things. But I have 3 sons who are now in their 20s, and just even through their high school years and college years of dating, that it was, they couldn't open doors. I don't know how you can develop relationship without at some point being able to, reach out and touch somebody, give them a hug or something like that. So it's also made it harder to develop relationships in my little view of the world.
Yeah, that's why I just avoid the whole dating thing all the time. I couldn't handle it.
Well, there's hookups. Because you don't have a relationship, you just hook up. So you're getting some touch, but it's not long range.
Well, and I guess this underlying current, like Slowly mentioned, this is of pornography and how this has become this addiction and this pattern that it's just like, and that's destroying relationships now. And that people become so numb to this excitation of this false way of relationship. And then when it actually would come to a real relationship, hopefully in a monogamous relationship, so it's like that it's like, oh, this isn't any fun anymore. I mean, this isn't like I'm all burned out. I mean, so it's just there's like the whole neuroscience and theology of pornography and just how devastating that is to the youth, to what relationship means, to be able to have relationships with another person. And I think and there's the statistics that like 90% of college students use this on a regular basis. I mean, it's just like ludicrous. And so it's just, so just how pervasive this is and like what it's destroying us, and the idea of the touch is just lost completely in that. because it's all this stimulus. And one of the things about that addiction that I mean, the psychology of especially pornography, but it's like, that's one addiction that it's not just like alcohol, where it's just like, I need more, more, more. It always has to be more different, more extreme, because once you get burned in one level, it's got to be even more, which then leads to even more. And so that's what's just so scary about this, that it's just like, it literally fries the brain. I show my students that these kids are too young, but there's that whole commercials, remember, like, this is your brain, this is your brain on drugs. And like, they haven't seen these commercials. I mean, it's like, and so I show this to them, so I'm like, this is your brain on form. And it's like, and they've done studies where it's like the neurosynapses are just like ripped apart, especially in certain areas. It's just like, and so, yeah, in terms of the most sacred touch that we have, it's like, that's what's being lost in our, and I think in younger people, in our society, in this business. It's like billions and billions dollar industry that's kind of running our country right now, but it's like kind of this all underground stuff that nobody wants to talk about. And so it's the touch, how important that is, and like the sacred touch, the most sacred touch we have as human persons.
Did you say 90%?
Yeah, that's pretty much like using it on a regular basis, like almost weekly.
Men
It's
and
just like-
women, or primarily?
Mostly men. I think women are a little less, maybe like 60 to 70.
Hmm.
But it's just like, it's so pervasive, it's so easy to get, and maybe there's different like kind of levels of things, but it's like, this is just what they do. I mean, it's like,
Well, it's like you said, though, there's different levels, but
Yeah.
it's always got to be more different and it escalates.
I mean, even like watching a football game, like the advertisement that come up, it's like, I mean, all of it starts there, and then it's like, well, I'll just keep going with that.
Yeah. So to kind of follow up on that, though, yes, please. So with that whole idea of pornography, I mean, we're talking about touch, but you're also talking about really kind of the emotional part of it is really kind of getting turned off, the real connectedness, almost if you think about, aside from physical touch, but just the emotional touch between the other. Yeah. I mean, has there been much, in terms of study on that kind of in conjunction with that?
I can't say precisely, but my speculation is, I mean, I brought the whole idea of the mirror neurons, and I think, I mean, those go really excited in like in true sexual intercourse connection, but it's like when it simply becomes the use of the other person as an object, then that whole system is just shut down. It's just, I'm going for my own single individualistic pleasure satisfactions and this excitation, and then getting all these particular hormones going, but it has no other connection to an actual, I mean, that was even, these other, it was like sex bots, it's like all you need is like this other robot thing. I mean, so that's where it's like there's this complete lack of this conversation, you know. But this, but no, I mean, I think that it's touching something so central in who we are. It's like when the best of us can come up and the deepest intimate relationship we have can have, and the greatest touch. But it's like when that's simply, when it's used by an artificial means, or that it's like that the mirror neuron system and seeing the other person and having this interconnection with this person is like, is all turned into this like solely self-satisfaction. Well then, yeah, it's like everything is then just, it's emptied of all meaning, and it turns us into the beast. We've lost the intentionality. That's just so scary.
I do not want to end on that note. You got to bring
So
us
yeah,
back
okay, so
up.
people, there's hope in this world. There are good young people who do care for each other, and there's that. Yes, I've been invited to do several weddings of these young couples who are choosing to not live together until they are going to be married. And it's like there's good people who are very intentional and very prayerful. And actually, I have to go to a mass right now where kids are in adoration, and like they have that they want to have benediction. There's these good prayerful kids who are intentionally getting to this. And so the generation coming up, they're good people. And so there is hope in this world, and God, as Archbishop Romero is saying, is acting in this world and is bringing about hope and life. And so it's like, let us relish this and continue to, as the end of every Mass, to proclaim the good news of the gospel with our lives.
Amen. Thank you.
trying to get up here.